So as you can see, this webinar is entitled How Hybrid AGMs Work or Really Work, and Are They Worth It? So as you all know, and as you can see on the screen right here, this webinar is eligible for 1.0 CPE credits. After this webinar, sometime between now and tomorrow, hopefully sooner than tomorrow, we will be sending out a certificate of completion to everyone that attended this webinar. Anyone that attended this webinar who is a licensed manager is welcome to go on the CMRAO website and register this credit. So this webinar is expected to last 1 hour. And during this webinar, we will be going over all things hybrid AGM. As many of you here know, I happen to operate Condonexus, and I've been in a privileged position where we have held dozens of hybrid AGMs. We've managed dozens of hybrid AGMs. And through that experience, we want to share with you what we've learned with hybrid AGMs. We've also worked with hundreds of condo managers, and through the conversations, we also want to share, what we've heard in terms of what works well when it comes to hybrid AGMs, and also, where things can potentially go wrong with hybrid AGMs. So we'll be giving tips on hybrid AGMs. We'll be going over pros and cons. We want this to be a very balanced webinar where we not only share the positives, but the maybe not so positives as well. We'll share how to technically set up a webinar. That's something that hasn't really been discussed much in condo land, but we'll share with you that and any legal requirements as they pertain to hybrid AGMs. So I'd also like to introduce our fellow panelists. Well, initially it was supposed to be panelists, but unfortunately Rakesh Rajdev from Optimus Technical Solutions became unavailable for this webinar because of a personal emergency. So Rakesh sends his regrets. But we do have Luis Hernandez here. So as many of you know, Luis is a lawyer at Levitt, Lella, Duggan, and Chaplick, also known as LDDC lawyers. And as many of you may also know, he has also been a speaker at many, I want to say tens of condo industry events, but many, and I've sat in on some of them as well, and he's super knowledgeable. So we're very lucky to have him here today to also share his experiences and knowledge about hybrid AGMs. He's chaired a few himself, so he may have some stories to tell too. So thank you, Luis, for joining us.
Thank you for the intro, Anthony.
No
Glad to be here.
Great. So we'll kick off the webinar with just talking about what is a hybrid AGM. So the simplest way to think about a hybrid AGM is it is just an AGM or a meeting taking place concurrently over two mediums. So it's taking place in parallel in two locations. And maybe it would help to visualize it a bit more. So I spent about 2 minutes to create this very simple diagram to show what a full hybrid AGM is. So on the left here on the continuum is a virtual AGM. Very simple. It's like what we're doing right now, where everyone is attending virtually through Zoom, and then they vote electronically online as well. Now, when you go to the total right of this continuum, you have a fully hybrid AGM. And what does that mean? It means, yes, for some participants, they wish to attend over Zoom. That, it might be a family that has children and they're unable to attend, so they just prefer Zoom. It could be someone maybe stuck at work or on vacation, or people with potential disabilities unable to go to an in-person meeting. So there's a Zoom option. But there might be a segment of the condo that also prefers to meet in person. So they may wish to also have an in-person location set up for the meeting as well, both in parallel. And for it to be fully hybrid, there's also two-way audio and two-way video. What does that mean? It means essentially those who, in terms of video, those who are attending in person have a screen set up in their location where they can see those who are attending virtually. And those who are attending virtually also are able to have a video feed of those who are attending. I'm getting confused here. Sorry, who are attending in person. You can see how it's already very complex. And then with regards to audio, if it's fully hybrid, those who attend in person can hear those who are attending virtually when those who are attending virtually are allowed to speak, and vice versa. There's electronic voting for those who are attending virtually, and then there is paper ballot voting for those who are attending in person. So a lot to think about, and this is maybe currently its most complex form of a hybrid AGM where there's two locations. In the future, there might even be more mediums. There could be things like the what is it called, the metaverse, or if AI goes where the visionaries expect it to go, we might be attending meetings telepathically. But for now, we're just talking about Zoom and in person. There's this whole in-between area as well where you can sort of do a partial hybrid AGM as well. So maybe close to the left is an example of where maybe you just set up a room in your condo where those who wish to attend in person can get a feed, like a video feed or just an audio feed of the Zoom webinar. They're unable to ask questions, they're unable to vote, and if they wish to vote, they've been asked to submit a proxy in advance. It can get a bit more complex if you go a bit more to the right, where if you want to allow them to also ask questions. So setting up a microphone or two microphones in the room, for example, adds even further complexity to a hybrid AGM. And if we go up even a bit more here on this continuum, maybe you want to allow them to vote. Well, I guess if you're allowing them to vote, you're pretty much already at the fully hybrid AGM. So that's the continuum for an AGM. And as mentioned, because we have had the opportunity to work with nearly 1,000 condos and hundreds of property managers, we've heard it all when it comes to AGMs. Very early on, back in 2021 or 2022, I've written about how condos should be selective about doing hybrid AGMs. So even though we provide the service at Condonexus, my advice has always been be selective. There are complexities that are involved. It is more costly. It is more. It does require more time and effort, and sometimes people can feel excluded from one channel or the other. So the receipts are on LinkedIn. I've posted about it. So I've never hailed it as some others have, where they say it's an evolution or the next wave of AGMs. I've always said be selective. So I will share some anecdotes, some bad, some good. And my most recent anecdote was actually yesterday, where I met with a property manager and their condo board, and they shared and they basically enlisted Condonexus this year for their AGM. And last year they had challenges with their hybrid AGM. They used a third party, a legal firm, and I don't know who it was. It could have been any legal firm. Multiple legal firms do it. So if you have one in your head, I don't know. It might be that, might not be. So yeah, they basically enlisted a third party legal firm, and apparently that firm used an iPhone or some type of smartphone as a microphone, and people online were really unable to hear them. There were massive audio issues. And when it came time for Q&A, the chairperson would take that phone and walk to the crowd and get the questions. So it didn't seem very seamless. It seemed like there was a lot of friction. So that's like sort of on one end of the continuum again, in terms of how complexity can make hybrid AGMs really challenging. There was another example recently where, again, we were enlisted, but in the previous year, they used another third-party provider. And in terms of registering attendees, um, it was all done very manually. So people would check in through a paper form at the front of the room, and their proxies, if they submitted proxies in advance, would theoretically be removed. There was some type of manual process for that as well. But given that there was also a virtual medium, there became a lot of distrust in the room about whether or not that process was actually working. Because as you'll hear later, it is very challenging to manually reconcile voting in an in-person AGM or in a hybrid AGM. That being said, there are many good examples where third parties are used. Um, and my favorite example, and because I happen to know what we do the most, is there was one AGM that we did, a hybrid AGM that we did. It was in the distillery district. It was late last year, and they reached out to us with 2 days left before their, it wasn't an AGM, it was actually an SGM, and they were looking to pass a borrowing bylaw to borrow a few $1 million to finance legal fees in a claim against the developer for structural defects. So they didn't have enough proxies with 2 days in advance. So they reached out to us. We did set up a proxy campaign and a hybrid AGM, and they were able to obtain over, I think it was over 190 proxies, 150 of those electronically and via hybrid. So there are also good examples. So I don't want to scare everyone away. And I know Luis has also been chaired or participated in probably various hybrid AGMs. So I don't know, Luis, do you have any examples of hybrid AGMs that may have gone well or not well?
Absolutely. As you mentioned at the beginning, I do a lot of AGMs. I'm sure some of the managers here have even seen me chair a couple of their meetings. But that means that I've done a fair number of hybrid AGMs as well. And I have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to it. So, I think the best one I was ever at was a relatively large condo, but what they did was they brought in an external third party. I have no idea what their costs were, but it was the whole shebang. They brought large tower speakers, they brought multiple screens and projectors, they had microphones for every person. Like I got one of those like lav microphones that was on my lapel. And it was really, really well done. And everyone seemed to be quite happy. People could log on and vote on their phone beforehand or via email. So I think all in all, it was a very successful hybrid AGM. But then I've had the other end of the spectrum, and this one is truly my favorite. I had a client, and they had what was going to be a fairly contentious AGM coming up. And leading up to it, I knew that they wanted to do it as a hybrid meeting. I followed up, I tried to get all the details, and as some will do, I was repeatedly reassured that it was going to go smoothly, that they had everything in place. And, I took them at their word. I show up to the meeting, and all that they have is a singular laptop. And I would love to say that it was a very good laptop, but it wasn't. It was an older computer with a very, very spotty camera. I don't even think it was capable of HD. It was one of those like 480p cameras, and no microphones, no speakers. It was purely based on the laptop. So when I was doing questions, it was worse than the iPhone example you just stated, Anthony. I actually had to walk around with a laptop that really only could hold charge for about 10 minutes and, move the laptop whenever any person was asking a question. So that was probably the worst hybrid AGM I ever did. It was probably about an hour longer than it needed to be because it was just a nightmare in terms of actually trying to get the people online to be able to hear the people in person. And then anything that was said online, I would have to repeat or regurgitate back to the audience. So it really created this uncomfortable dynamic. And fortunately, everyone was very patient. I think in a way it helped reduce the tension in the room because the focus all of a sudden became just how badly this hybrid AGM was being run, as opposed to the actual content of the meeting, which I guess will be a silver lining in that situation.
Absolutely. We've heard many of those stories. We've heard stories where chair people um, go into a virtual AGM and then surprise, it's actually a hybrid where the condo has set up a hybrid meeting without even letting anyone know. We had a case of that yesterday as well, where a condo surprised us with a makeshift hybrid and it went longer than it really needed to go. And there were technical issues left, right, and center. So that's one of the reasons why we're holding this, because we want to make sure that you're all prepared to understand the challenges that come with hybrid AGMs should you wish to proceed with one. And again, it can be a great option if it suits your condo's needs. But we want to open the books so that you're aware of what it actually entails. Um, and I know there are we have over 350 attendees right now. If anyone would like to share any anecdotes about their hybrid AGMs, you're definitely welcome to raise your hand as well right now. If you have any good anecdotes or even not so good anecdotes, you're welcome to raise your hand to share them. And if anyone has any particular questions about hybrid AGMs, I have opened up the Q&A as well. So we can frame our meeting around your questions also. So feel free to write questions into the chat. There are questions about cost right now, which we will get into later. And I do see a hand raised from Carolyn Barlett. Carolyn, I'm just going to unmute your microphone in case you want to share an anecdote or something about hybrid AGMs. You just have to click unmute on your end. Oh, was that an accidental hand raise, Carolyn? I've unmuted your microphone, but I don't see you unmuting on your, oh, did you? Nope. Sorry. I guess you're not looking. If you are looking to share a story, certainly raise your hand again, and we'll certainly get back to you later in the meeting. Um, so I guess we'll go over some of the challenges in an AGM first. So I've listed 5 of what I think are the biggest challenges with self-managed hybrid AGMs. Audio visual being the first one, second being reconciling voting, attendance accuracy, costs, and inclusivity. And we'll start off with the first one, which is audio visual setup. So usually when a group wants to set up a hybrid AGM, they want multiple microphones for those who are in person. They want one for the front of the table. They want at least one that can roam around the room. So one thing that some of these impromptu hybrid AGM setups don't consider is, well, how do you connect 2 microphones to a laptop? I mean, some you might be able to, but generally speaking, it's not possible to attach 2 microphones to the exact same laptop. So then, they might think, okay, well, let's have 2 devices on at the same time with 2 microphones. Um, eh, well, I mean, the challenge there is that'll actually create a lot of echoing. So you don't want that. So we'll go over the exact equipment you need to avoid that echoing. But even with the visual setup, usually rooms are fairly small and you want video to be um, broadcast. You want to be able to share a wide angle of all the panelists and maybe even those in the room. So sometimes your standard 480p camera, like the one that was shared in Luis's story, might not totally suffice. Usually you'll need more of a wider angle panoramic camera or like an owl camera. Um, so audio-visual setup is one of those things. Reconciling voting is a huge issue with self-managed hybrid AGMs. So if you think about it, let's think of a scenario where suppose in one unit there resides co-owners, let's say Clark Kent and Lois Lane, and suppose that let's call it unit 123, submitted a proxy ahead of the AGM, And then Clark Kent decides to attend the AGM in person for the hybrid component. So Clark is there in person, and then you give Clark a ballot. But then Lois Lane shows up virtually. Um, so it's like, okay, so Lois gets to vote online. Well, it's like which vote should take precedence? And it might be simple for one if there's like only a few attendees. In fact, even with the few attendees, it gets very complicated very fast. But suppose you're able to figure it out. Imagine this scaled up to 20, 30, 40 attendees. It starts to get really challenging to reconcile voting to ensure that there's only one vote per unit. So if you're managing a self-hybrid AGM, we'll give you some tips a bit later on how to reconcile voting. Attendance falls under the same sort of challenges. Um, so essentially, someone might show up in person, someone might show up virtually, and they might have a proxy submitted as well. So again, there's extra careful attendance record keeping required. Cost is a major factor for a lot of condos. So I mean, if you do it yourself, we'll walk through the costs a bit later and all the equipment you need. But you are probably talking in is probably at least four figures. Um, and yeah, you could hire a third party as well. So I guess we're talking about more managed hybrids. That's definitely going to go into the four figures as well. And you might think, why should I do that when I can just get my own equipment? Usually, whenever you hire a third party, the largest expenditure is the labor costs. So you're talking about usually bringing in two AV technicians. The meeting, and they'll usually arrive an hour and a half before the meeting starts. The meeting will take 2 hours, so that's about 3.5 hours times two. And if it's managed hybrid, usually there's a virtual component. So there's another 3 hours spent usually setting up things like the attendance application and starting the practice session earlier, etc. So you're looking at about 10 additional extra hours of work that you need to pay an outsourced provider. And what is 10 hours of work worth? How much does that cost? How much would 10 hours of a plumber cost? You can see it starts to get very expensive when you think about that time allocation. So costs are a huge factor, whether it's a self-managed hybrid or it's a managed hybrid where you outsource it to a third party. And the last thing here is inclusivity. And when I speak about inclusivity, I'm more talking about how do we ensure that both parties are in both channels, both mediums, virtual and in person, are engaged during a meeting. So I'll go over those tips really quickly on how to overcome some of those challenges. So the first tip here is really test your audio visual in advance. Even for us at Condonexus, whenever one of our virtual meeting hosts has to update their Zoom or update their operating system or change their laptop, we ask them to test their software before they go into a meeting. And that should be no different if you're running a hybrid AGM for the very first time. In fact, it should be more important if that's the case. So test it early and test it often and make sure to do one test right before the meeting as well, because configurations can change. And you're probably also wondering, well, how do we even set up a hybrid AGM? Um, well, I mean, this hasn't been spoken about much, but we want to give you all the information to properly set up a hybrid AGM from a technical perspective if you choose to do it yourself. So we want to give away sort of the recipe for the secret sauce here. So in terms of audio requirements, obviously you want multiple microphones because you want one at the panelist table, but you also want one to be roaming around in the room. But as we talked about earlier, in order for there to be multiple microphones in the room, there needs to be some piece of equipment that prevents the echoing because you can't just have two laptops with two microphones attached. and because there will be feedback and echoing. So you need this device called an audio mixer. And what an audio mixer does is it takes the input from the microphone, so it takes the sound from the microphone, and it combines the sounds together, mixes them together, and then passes it along to your laptop um, so that there's no echoing. And also because the cables that go from an audio mixer don't necessarily fit into your laptop, you'll usually need an audio interface as well. So that's another device that you'll need. You'll need speakers, obviously, speakers that can project throughout an entire room. So simple, small computer speakers usually won't suffice. So you'll need speakers and you'll need a bunch of cables. In terms of the video requirements, you'll need a webcam or a camera that is hopefully panoramic or can, rotate to see who's speaking. Because typical webcams like mine, for example, if that were used, it would not be able to show the entire front table. You'll need a projector to be able to project a video if, for example, some virtual attendee wishes to say run for the board and they want to give a speech. It's fair if they're also given an opportunity that is equal to what someone in person would be able to have as well. And it's useful to have an extra laptop. So one for controlling everything pertaining to um, uh, the video feed, the webcast, and a separate one if the chairperson's using a separate one, because you don't want them all in one laptop in case you end up sharing the wrong screen. You don't want a screen sharing mishap. And you don't want things to accidentally close. So you want an extra laptop. So you can see that the costs start to really rack up. And in terms of how to set up a hybrid AGM, this is the setup. This is a diagram that shows how everything would need to be connected. So microphone needs to be connected to the audio mixer. So the sound goes into the audio mixer. It goes into the audio interface, which enables it to be connected to the laptop. And then any sound that comes from the laptop, so we're talking about the Zoom, the sounds from the Zoom webinar need to be also heard by those who are attending in person. So they need to come out, go through the audio interface, again, go through the mixer so that they can be shared through the speakers. So the microphone sounds get shared through the speakers, through this mixer, and the sounds that come in to the from Zoom get shared to the speakers. You'll also need a webcam and a projector. Sometimes it's even helpful to have multiple laptops in case the webcam happens to be in a different area of the room compared to the speakers. So you can see it does start to get a bit complex if it's something you've never done before. So that's AV, just sort of in a nutshell. Careful attendance and vote record keeping. So again, it can be very challenging to track attendance and voting across two mediums. And if you think about proxies as well, it's sort of like three mediums because the proxy is sort of a vote too. So what we recommend is definitely have that owner's list present with you. And you'll have to have at least 3 columns to sort of check off and do record keeping. One column needs to say, are they attending in person? And check it off next to their name if they are. Another column needs to say, are they attending virtually? And again, check off their name if they are. And have they submit a proxy in advance? And again, check it off if they have. And you'll also need to check off, have they been provided a ballot for in person? And have they been provided a ballot virtually? And usually, because it can be difficult deciding on which medium gets their vote counted. Is it the in-person? Is it the virtual? Or is it the advanced proxy? I believe it's important. If you're doing, again, this is all for self-managed hybrid AGMs. With managed hybrid AGMs, there's more tech that makes this a lot more seamless. But with self-managed hybrid AGMs, I would say have one medium's voting rights sort of override the other ones. So for example, if Clark Kent comes to the in-person AGM and gets a ballot, whether or not if he submitted a proxy in the past in advance of the meeting, or if Lois Lane also attends virtually, well, Clark Kent's ballot is what's going to count. That proxy is going to be ripped up, and Lois is not going to be provided a a virtual ballot. Or maybe it's a virtual ballot that counts, or maybe because they've submitted a proxy, they don't get a ballot. But one of the mediums, I believe, needs to take precedence over the other ones. So that's how I would take care of it if I had to self-manage a hybrid AGM without any technology. Again, of course, with managed hybrid AGMs, I know we at Condonexus, we use an attendance application where anyone that checks in person, um, we do get to just like through the application, um, uh, it does help to um, revoke proxies if they're given a ballot, or revoke online voting rights if they're given a ballot, or manage basically that precedence in voting. Um, Hybrid AGM tip number 3: try to start small. So, really try to understand why your hybrid, like why do your owners want a hybrid AGM? Is it just for everyone to get together, or do they want to vote at that AGM as well? Because as shown in this continuum, you don't necessarily need to do a fully hybrid AGM. Potentially you could set up that room where those who want to attend in person can attend in person and watch the AGM. And you can advise them, submit a proxy in advance, and maybe those in the room, their attendance won't necessarily be counted, but they'll be able to watch it, for example. So maybe you don't have to go full hybrid. One option we've seen many condos do as well is just conduct a virtual AGM, because an AGM is a meeting of business, and it's very efficient for that. But then after the virtual AGM, hold a cocktail hour, hold a town hall, hold a social gathering after the meeting of business has been conducted. So that's maybe the smallest, when it comes to start small. And as their demands, if your owners do demand more, because there's a desire for that, and that's fair. If a community wants to do more, then you can start to think more about how can we add more features to the hybrid AGM. I think effective chairing is critically important. We find a lot of times, with hybrid AGMs, it's usually following the request of owners that feel like they don't have a voice and they want to speak. And I think that's very fair, because the AGM is that one time of the year where owners get to meet their board and voice their thoughts in front of their board. The challenge is sometimes there are owners that not only feel like they want to have a voice, but they want to monopolize their voice, or they want to monopolize the microphone. So unfortunately, sometimes hybrid AGMs invite those types of people. So you want to have effective chairing so that rules of order are followed throughout the meeting. And obviously, because there are two mediums, there's a virtual medium and an in-person medium. One medium can feel left out compared to the other. So when it comes to Q&A, or even when it comes to motions, what we recommend is get a question or motion from the virtual room first, and then get one from the in-person room, and continue to do that over and over again. And go from one medium to the other so that both feel like they have a voice. And the final tip I have here is to stay safe. And what I mean by that is, when you set up a hybrid AGM, there could be a lot of cables on the ground, and they could stretch across the room. So the last thing you want is some type of liability event, where someone trips and hurts themselves, or even where you damage your equipment. So if there are cables along the floor, certainly be sure to tape them down to avoid those incidences. The last thing you want is even further costs affecting your budget. So that's my presentation on challenges and tips and what a hybrid AGM is. And with that, I'll pass it over to Luis.
Thank you, Anthony. I really love those tips because I completely agree with everything that you said, and I think that you've really laid out the practical considerations of how a hybrid AGMs really work and the concerns. And I'm seeing that we're getting a ton of questions, so I'm going to pivot a little bit. I'm not going to fully present everything that I had planned uh, to allow us a little bit more time to do questions, but as a starter, and you'll all forgive me, I don't have slides like Anthony. I figured you don't need the boring legal stuff. You really want to see the visual practical. But I think one really important thing to understand about hybrid AGMs is that they exist in this nebulous space, that they exist in a gray area when it comes to the legalities of how they should be run. And by that, I mean, effectively, hybrid AGMs are not really discussed or considered in the legislation. In the legislation, what they do is they consider virtual meetings or in-person meetings, and there are a number of procedures and expectations that deal with both. However, hybrid is one of those concepts that is not really dealt with in the Condo Act. And just to take a little bit of history here, virtual AGMs were arguably something that were not permitted pre-pandemic. However, the pandemic really caused condominiums to have to pivot and adapt to a new world where we couldn't get together and meet in large rooms. And it's created the advent of these virtual meetings, but as a result, also the hybrid meetings, because a lot of people were just unsatisfied with a full virtual meeting. So during the pandemic, the legislature instituted a new schedule to the Condominium Act that temporarily permitted condos to hold virtual meetings. And after a lot of advocacy by industry stakeholders, such as organizations like ACMO, CCI, CAI, and a lot of professionals in the space, eventually the government, as part of their new legislation, uh, codified virtual meetings and the ability to hold virtual meetings and do electronic voting on October 1st of 2023. So there was a lot of advocacy being done in the background. So I would like to, give some credit where it's due to everybody who was a part of that. But when the government instituted Bill 91, and I always laugh when I read the names of the bills under this government, the Less Red Tape, Stronger Economy Act of 2023 ended up changing various provisions of the Condominium Act, among many other pieces of legislation, to allow for virtual meetings to take place. And in that regard, one of the changes of the Condominium Act was to Section 45, Sub 6 of the Condominium Act, which dealt with the method in which meetings can be held. Now, I'm not going to put it up for you, but what I will do is I'll just read you the language that was introduced. And it says that, subject to the bylaws and subsection 8 of that same legislation, a meeting of owners may be held entirely by one or more telephonic or electronic means, or by any combination of in-person attendance and by one or more telephonic or electronic meetings. And with that, you have heard the full extent of how hybrid meetings are regarded in the legislation, which means that they have contemplated the idea that there might be a combination of virtual or in person, but they don't tell you how it should be run. They don't provide any further guidance on how that changes voting requirements or the technology that you must have. They've really left it quite open-ended for condos to determine what is best for their community and to work with providers to be able to facilitate that type of meeting. So it's a really interesting situation But what I want to impart upon all of you is you do not need to have a condominium bylaw to hold a hybrid AGM. You also do not really need any type of rule or any type of policy that deals with hybrid AGMs. This is just something that is available to condominiums if they choose to do so. And I did see a question pop up at one point, so I'm just going to address it now because I think it's a really valuable question. Um, it's up to a board of directors to decide in what manner they're going to hold their meetings of owners, including their AGMs. So what that means is, and same for a requisition meeting, for example, this means that it's up to the board to decide if it's going to be in person, if it's going to be virtual, if it's going to be hybrid. And I know that a lot of owners generally have strong opinions on the subject and will demand that they be done in a certain way. And owners don't really have the right legally to demand that, but they do from a political and practical perspective. And I've seen this happen where if you have a community of, let's say, elderly people who likely have less access to technology, you know, they may not be able to participate in a virtual meeting and they will object strenuously to it. And ultimately, if a board doesn't listen to what they have to say, then that board could be removed. Same as in any political situation, and they'll be replaced by a board that's willing to do it in person. So, in my opinion, what I find is really valuable about the hybrid AGM is that, and depending on how it's done, it can be the best of both worlds. And if it's done poorly, it can be the worst of both worlds. And with that, I just really want to touch a little bit on the upsides and downsides, but from a legal perspective. So I'll start with the downsides because it's nicer to end on a more positive note. But on the downsides, I think one of the main issues is that if it's run improperly, it can be quite inefficient. I noted the anecdote earlier of the laptop and having to walk around and having to repeat owners' questions, whether it was in person to the online people or online to the in person people. And at the end of the day, the inefficiency is problematic for two reasons. One, it creates a lack of engagement. People will not sit around for a very long meeting. They won't pay attention. They won't engage. And if it's inefficient, you might get people to leave, and that might affect your quorum or the ability to properly transact the business of the corporation. The second part, and it dovetails into the next comment that I had, is with respect to costs. At the end of the day, there's no clear analysis of what is the cost of an AGM, what's the cost of a virtual, what's the cost of an in-person. A lot of the times, these things are based on just that, time. And for example, if you have your lawyer attend your annual general meeting to act as your chairperson, you all know that every minute that we spend there is time that we're billing the corporation. So it is in the best interest of the corporation to keep their meetings efficient and concise, because otherwise you're paying increased billable hours on things that can otherwise be avoided. It also creates additional costs with respect to the tech, but it also creates costs with respect to other professionals. I know that recently auditors have taken to charging additional costs if they have to attend a meeting in person. And those are costs that you need to be mindful of, because even if you're holding a hybrid AGM, you might have a board that says, I want the auditor there to present in person. The next part that I think is a downside, and again, is somewhat related to the legal aspect of it, is it makes the chairperson's job harder. And I will say, if you have an experienced chairperson, such as myself or other lawyers in the space, they should be able to navigate it because we've seen every iteration. But a lot of condos, especially those that don't have contentious meetings, they will want to self-manage this meeting process. You'll have a board president who's going to be the chairperson, or you as the managers might as well be the chairperson. And in those situations, When you've got a hybrid meeting, it really can add logistical challenges to trying to pay attention to what is effectively two meetings. You're trying to pay attention to a virtual space and also an in-person space. And if your chairperson is not adept at technology, they get nervous, any type of circumstance that might affect the ability to run the meeting, it will make their job more challenging. And in turn, it will make the meeting, again, less efficient and frankly, less enjoyable for all of the attendees. Now, the last piece, and I think this is a big one, is it could really create a potential for disputes when you have a contentious setting. So one of the things that Anthony talked about was appropriately keeping track of voting and registration. And as I'm sure some of you will know, those that don't consider yourselves lucky, when you've got contentious meetings, a lot of the times there's accusations levied about really whether certain people are entitled to vote or whether votes were properly received and counted and monitored. And if you've got a hybrid AGM where you've got digital votes and you've got in-person votes, you might get an increased possibility for disputes because there will be accusations that will be levied, whether appropriate or not. So it is something to keep in mind and perhaps to avoid hybrid AGMs in certain contexts. And I would always recommend that you speak to your professionals, speak to your auditors, your lawyers, you managers, speak to your higher ups to see in certain circumstances whether you should be doing that. And to wrap up on the positive, I do believe that hybrid AGMs are the way of the future. They are a phenomenal tool to increase participation and voter representation. So getting quorum used to be very difficult in certain contexts. Over time, with technology of electronic proxies and then electronic meetings, that issue has dissipated a little bit. However, by doing hybrid, and I said earlier, it's the best of both worlds. You could have all of the snowbirds log in and join and participate in their community online, while all of the in-person individuals who may have challenges with technology or frankly just prefer to see their neighbors and get a cup of coffee and a cookie, it would be really helpful to get them and give them the opportunity to be in person. Additionally, I spoke about inefficiencies, but there are also efficiencies to be found in hybrid AGMs. Again, because it allows greater participation and use of technology, there are ways to implement more expedient voting. You can encourage voting in advance via proxies or e-votes. I've seen some really cool hybrid AGMs where technology is presented where people can vote in person, but not with a physical ballot. They do it by clicking a link in their email and voting on their phone, and it takes 20 seconds. And it's really easy for those who are comfortable. And the last couple pieces I want to talk about are the flexibility of accommodation. And it's not something we've really discussed here very much, but a hybrid AGM really does allow you to be more sensitive to accommodation needs. Individuals that might have disabilities, whether it be auditory, visual, or physical, can really benefit from a hybrid AGM because if they struggle going to the meeting in person, they can attend the virtual component. And nowadays you can implement things like closed captioning on Zoom meetings, and they can increase the text or the size of the video and really get them to engage, or they can wear headphones. In the same way, for those that are technologically impaired or may not want to participate virtually, they can actually go to the physical site and you can prepare accommodations for them as well, whether it means sitting at the front of the room or accessing certain spaces in a way that is favorable to their disabilities. And the last piece I want is the cost savings. We've talked about how it could be an increased cost depending on how you do it, but it can also mitigate your costs. It could also lead to lower costs in certain situations. For example, again, if your auditor joins in virtually, they can present to the entire room, virtual and in person. They'll be up on the screen. They can present their minutes or their audited financial statements, and they'll do it without charging you an extra fee. Same with the lawyers, depending on the type of meeting, you could have a lawyer participate virtually for an in-person meeting. Now, that's not usually the case, but even in those circumstances, there are ways that you can potentially find cost savings with respect to not having to book an external room, right? Sometimes you have to book an external room to meet all of the demand for attendees. And by having a virtual room, you could then just use the party room because you're only expecting half or a quarter of your owners to attend in person and then everyone else virtually. So from our perspective, there are a lot of upsides from hybrid AGMs, and we do think that they are the way of the future. We're seeing them more often, but it really is a matter of working with the right partners to make sure that it runs smoothly and that everyone has an enjoyable experience, because it can go downhill quite quickly. And I think with that, we could probably move on to some of the questions. Anthony, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think that's a great idea. So there are many typed questions in the Q&A window, and I've picked some to answer live. There were many questions about the cost differential between virtual and hybrid. While I don't want to I don't want to share our costs necessarily, because I my hope is for this webinar to be more of an educational webinar as opposed to a marketing one. But again, if you think about the additional hours required for resources to set up a hybrid AGM, you're talking about two technicians, so two resources arriving an hour and a half early for the meeting to set up everything, a 2-hour meeting, so that's 3.5 hours times two, and probably an additional 3 hours of work for the virtual meeting provider. So when you start to think about 10 hours of work, that can give you a sense of how much it would cost for a hybrid meeting. So our hybrid meetings can usually end up being more than doubling the cost in total. The cost usually doubles when you want to do a hybrid meeting as opposed to just a standalone virtual AGM. So I hope that gives you some sense of cost. So next question comes from, my screen's moving a little bit. So next question comes from Ada Ruza. So Ada writes, in a hybrid AGM, how is electronic voting done for those owners who are not attending in person? So again, hopefully you're using a hosted virtual meeting provider, because that makes voting a lot easier. They can send electronic ballots to your owners and ensure one vote per unit adherence to electronic voting. With Condonexus, we even have an attendance application, so those who check in person can have their votes reconciled with those who attend virtually. Now, when you don't use a hosted virtual AGM provider, electronic voting is not so straightforward. I've heard of raise of hands being done, or sometimes an email being sent to the PM, or with regards to a unit owner's vote, or sometimes unit owners typing into the chat who they'd like to vote for. The record keeping there is very challenging. So I personally recommend engaging a hosted virtual AGM or electronic voting provider.
If I can step in there, Anthony, and just add
Yep.
a little bit of extra commentary there, I think it's really important to highlight that you need to plan this as well as possible in advance, because there's a lot of other considerations. And I'm just going to point one, record keeping, right? It's not just that you want to make sure everything is done appropriately and fairly, but it's also that there are records that are produced at these meetings, the voting records, the tallies, all of that forms part of the corporation's records, and they are producible to an extent under Section 55 of the Act. So if you're not keeping these things in order, you could really find yourself in trouble later on when you get that one condo commando who brings a cat case because they've asked for voting tallies, etc., and they're not able to get them because your house wasn't in order before the AGM. So it's just really important to make sure that you've crossed your T's and dotted your I's before you embark on a project like this.
Absolutely. I do see many questions about what equipment is required to hold a hybrid AGM. So we did share that information during the webcast. If you need these slides, or um, we have some of these slides shared in a blog that's published on our website, condonexus.com, on hybrid AGM. So go into our blog and look for that hybrid AGM blog, and maybe I'll share it as well in a follow-up email to those who have attended virtually. So next question is, let me just keep scrolling down. Here's a good one. In your profession, that's more of how about this one? This is a good one from Daniel Gardner. Daniel writes, for the Clark Kent Lois Lane example, can you really choose to prefer one method of voting? I thought the Condo Act said that a vote of joint owners of a unit goes to the majority. So Clark and Lois would have to agree, otherwise it doesn't count, right? Luis, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this one.
I want to read the question a little bit. Where am I looking here?
It's near the bottom. It's like the fifth, the sixth bottom one, seventh bottom one.
Okay. Just want to make sure that I'm understanding. Can you really choose to prefer one method? Yeah, so Daniel's actually correct on this one with respect to what 51 sub 3 says of the act. So if the general principle is each unit gets one vote, and usually, even if there's joint owners, one person will speak on behalf of that unit and will vote on their behalf. But Daniel here does make a very good point in that, and it's not section 51 3, it's it's technically 51. Where am I looking? Oh, it is 51 sub 3. Sorry, looking at the wrong act part of the act here. But yeah, so basically, the majority of the owners do need to exercise their right to vote, and if they are not in, there's not a majority, or there's two owners and they're not in agreement, then neither vote will count. And I think that makes intuitive sense for most of you, because ultimately, since there's only one vote, if the people who are responsible for advancing that vote can't agree, then it's not up to the condominium, or in this case, the meeting provider or anything like that, to try and discern which one they should be listening to. So it is something to be mindful of. It's not something that comes up very often, but when it does, you're 100% correct. It is a majority of the owners of the unit that can exercise the vote. Otherwise, if there's a split or disagreement, uh, i.e., lack of a clear majority, then yeah, the vote will not be counted or should not be counted. But
Yeah.
that's a situation that should always be raised to your chairperson during the meeting, because your chairperson will ultimately have the authority to make that determination. The chair is a quasi judicial role, so they're there as an independent party to make decisions as it relates to that meeting.
Yep. And that's one of the challenges that's another key challenge of a hybrid AGM when separate owners from the same unit attend across multiple mediums. And one of the challenges with record keeping at condos is, as far as I know, most owner records at condos do not distinguish the ownership percentages of joint owners. So it makes it really challenging for a property manager to decide which owner's vote should count. So again, when you add multiple mediums, it does add complexity to a meeting. I know it is 12 o'clock right now, so I do want to respect everyone's time. So we'll just answer one more question and then we'll wrap it up. Lindsay Black writes, is the reason why we don't need a bylaw because we are fulfilling the in-person requirement? Luis?
It's funny, Anthony, because I saw the same question. I was going to suggest we should answer that one before we go. Um, no, that there is no in-person requirement. Um, the reason you don't need a bylaw is because it's now built into the Condominium Act. So I referenced that section of the Condominium Act, 45 sub 6. And what that section of the act specifically talks about is that the meeting can be held either in person or virtually, or in any combination of the two methods. So I want to be abundantly clear to everyone. There is no such thing as an in-person requirement for a meeting under the Condominium Act. The requirements are for a meeting to be held, right? In certain contexts, if it's an AGM within 6 months of the end of the fiscal year, if it's a requisitioned meeting within 35 days of the requisition being received, and then there's a bunch of other circumstances that are required. But at the end of the day, it is up to a board of directors to determine in what method the meeting is going to be held, in person, virtual, or hybrid. A bylaw may still be useful in certain contexts to create a framework or expectations as to how any type of meeting is going to be run within a condominium, but it's not something that's required anymore. A board, even an old condo that has no bylaws in this regard, could rely on the Condominium Act and call a fully virtual or a hybrid meeting, and they will have, without the owner's consent or approval, and they will have done nothing wrong. They will have been exercising their discretion as the board of the condominium. So I hope that answers that.
Thanks, Luis. And it is a bit past 12, so we'll wrap up the meeting. So again, we understand that there has been a lot of hype over hybrid meetings over the past year or so. We also do believe it is a future, and technology just needs to catch up to make it easier to self-manage a hybrid AGM. We've always, our company line has always been, we recommend that condos be selective about whether they want to pursue hybrid AGMs or not, because there are complexities to it, which we've shared here. And we always recommend, if you do a hybrid AGM, try to go with a third-party vendor that specializes in it and has a lot of experience doing it. It will make the tech a lot more seamless, because you want those meetings to go off without a hitch. So with that said, I do want to thank everyone for attending. I know Wednesday mornings can be very busy for property managers, so we really appreciate your time, and we always try to hold meetings that are entertaining and informative. So we hope that this was entertaining and informative. So thank you, everyone, all 360 of you, for attending. And I also want to thank Luis Hernandez, because Luis, you provided amazing insights for today's meeting. So thank you so much, Luis.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure. And just for everybody's sake, because I've done this at other webinars, I'm going to put my email address in the chat if anyone is interested. But you can find me online as well.
Yep. And we'll certainly share your email address in a follow-up email that will go out to all attendees. So everyone, look out for a follow-up email for attending this meeting, and also look out for a subsequent certificate that will be emailed to you, hopefully by this afternoon, by the latest by tomorrow morning, so that you can appropriately register this credit with a CMRAO. So thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar, and we hope that you'll join us again for future infotaining webinars that we at Condonexus will be holding. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.